The elevator stopped between the 42nd and 43rd floors of Manhattan Presbyterian Hospital at exactly 11:47 p.m. And inside it, Richard Blackwood was dying. His chest felt like someone had wrapped barbed wire around his heart and was slowly tightening it with each labored breath. The 62-year-old real estate mogul pressed his palm against the mahogany-paneled wall, his $2,000 Italian leather shoes slipping slightly on the polished marble floor as his knees buckled. The elevator's emergency phone hung useless. The storm had knocked out half the building's communication systems. Outside, Hurricane Elena was tearing through the city with winds that made the 60-story building sway like a ship at sea. And Richard Blackwood, the man who owned half of Manhattan's skyline, who had built an empire worth $14 billion, who had never shown weakness in front of another human being in his entire life, was about to collapse in front of a night janitor he had never bothered to notice before. Miguel Santos had been cleaning these elevators for 3 years, and in all that time, the man in the $1,000 suit had never once looked at him. Not when Miguel held the door. Not when Miguel apologized for his cleaning cart being in the way. Not when Miguel had quietly wished him good evening in barely accented English, hoping for just a nod of acknowledgement that never came. To Richard Blackwood, Miguel was invisible part of the building's machinery, no more human than the vacuum he pushed or the mop he carried. But tonight, as the lights flickered and the elevator groaned under the storm's assault, Miguel was the only person standing between Richard and death. "Sir?" Miguel's voice cut through the mechanical whir of the stalled elevator. "Sir? Are you okay?" Richard's vision blurred as he turned toward the sound. He saw a man in his early 40s, compact and strong, with calloused hands that spoke of decades of manual labor and dark eyes that held an intelligence Richard had never bothered to notice. Miguel was still holding his cleaning supplies, but he had set down his mop bucket and was moving toward Richard with the kind of purposeful calm that came from experience with emergencies. Richard started to say he was fine, the way he always said he was fine. But the words died as his chest seized with a pain so sharp it drove him to his knees. His breath came in short, desperate gasps. Each heartbeat felt like his chest was being crushed by an invisible vice. Miguel was beside him instantly, his hands steady and sure. Miguel asked, his voice professionally calm. "Is it radiating down your left arm? Any numbness in your fingers?" The questions were so specific, so medically precise, that Richard looked at him with confusion, even through his agony. This was a janitor asking about pain, radiation, and numbness. This was a man he had dismissed as uneducated, asking the kind of questions only a medical professional would know to ask. "How do you?" Richard began, but another wave of pain cut him off. Miguel was already reaching into his cleaning cart, pulling out a small emergency kit that Richard had never noticed before. Inside were medical supplies that had no business being in a janitor's cart. Nitroglycerin tablets, a blood pressure cuff, a stethoscope, and other items Richard couldn't identify through his haze of pain. "I need you to put this under your tongue," Miguel said, placing a small white tablet in Richard's palm. "It's nitroglycerin. It will help with the chest pain." "You're a janitor," Richard gasped, the words coming out harsher than he intended. "Why do you have—" "Because," Miguel said quietly, his eyes meeting Richard's for the first time in 3 years. "I used to be something else." If you're enjoying this story so far, don't forget to hit the like button and subscribe. Drop a comment telling me where in the world you're watching from. I love hearing from you. Richard took the medication, his corporate mind still trying to process what was happening. Outside, lightning illuminated the city through the elevator's small window, and in that brief flash of light, Richard saw something in Miguel's face that stopped his questions cold. This wasn't just a janitor who happened to know first aid. This was someone with real medical knowledge, someone who moved with the confidence of years of training. "Who are you?" Richard whispered. Miguel was checking Richard's pulse, his fingers finding the rhythm with practiced ease. "Right now, I'm the person who's going to keep you alive until we can get you to the cardiac unit." The elevator shuddered as another gust of wind hit the building. The emergency lighting flickered, casting dancing shadows on the walls. Richard felt his consciousness wavering, but Miguel's voice kept him anchored. "Stay with me, Mr. Blackwood. Talk to me. Tell me about your medical history. Have you had any cardiac episodes before?" Richard blinked in surprise. "You know my name?" A ghost of a smile crossed Miguel's face. "I've been cleaning your office for 3 years. I know you take your coffee black, you work until at least midnight every night, and you haven't taken a vacation in longer than I've been here." His expression grew serious. "What I don't know is whether you've been ignoring symptoms of heart disease." The directness of the question cut through Richard's usual defenses. Maybe it was the medication. Maybe it was the pain. Or maybe it was the strange intimacy of being trapped in a small space with someone who was trying to save his life. But he found himself answering honestly. "Some chest tightness lately," he admitted. "Nothing serious. Just stress." Miguel's expression darkened. "How long is lately?" "A few months. Maybe 6. "And you didn't see a doctor?" Richard almost laughed, but it came out as a painful wheeze. "I don't have time for doctors." Miguel was quiet for a moment, continuing to monitor Richard's vital signs. When he spoke, his voice carried a weight that Richard couldn't identify. "My father said the same thing. He was too busy working, too important to waste time on checkups. He died at 58 of a massive heart attack while working late at his construction job." The words hung in the air between them. Richard found himself really looking at Miguel for the first time. Not through him, not around him, but at him. He saw the lines around his eyes that spoke of worry and responsibility. He saw the wedding ring on Miguel's finger, worn thin from years of wear. He saw the small photo tucked into the pocket of Miguel's uniform shirt. A young girl with pigtails and a gap-toothed smile. "Your daughter?" Richard asked, nodding toward the photo. Miguel's face softened. "Sophia. She's 7. She wants to be a doctor when she grows up." His voice carried a mixture of pride and something else. Regret, maybe, or longing. "She's the reason I work nights. I can be home when she gets back from school." Richard processed this information with the same analytical mind that had built his empire. A single father working nights to spend time with his daughter. A man with medical knowledge working as a janitor. A person he had walked past thousands of times without seeing. "Where did you learn?" Richard asked. "The medical training." Miguel hesitated, his hands still working with professional efficiency to monitor Richard's condition. "Medical school," he said finally. "Universidad de Buenos Aires. I was in my residency when I came to the United States." The confession hung between them like a bridge Richard had never known existed. "You're a doctor." "I was." Miguel's voice carried a pain that had nothing to do with physical injury. "My credentials aren't recognized here. The process to get licensed in the United States is complex, expensive, time-consuming, and I needed to work immediately when I arrived. Sophia was only 4, and her mother had already left us." Richard felt something shift in his chest that had nothing to do with his cardiac condition. "So you became a janitor." "I became whatever I needed to become to keep my daughter safe and fed," Miguel corrected gently. "Cleaning floors doesn't make me less of a man, or less of a father, but it does mean that most people look right through me." The accusation was quiet, but unmistakable. Richard had looked through Miguel for 3 years, had treated him as furniture, as part of the building's infrastructure, rather than as a human being, with a story, with dreams, with the kind of medical expertise that was currently keeping Richard alive. "I'm sorry," Richard said, and meant it in a way he hadn't meant an apology in years. Miguel met his eyes. "Thank you, but right now, we need to focus on keeping you stable until help arrives." As if summoned by his words, the elevator's emergency communication system crackled to life. "This is building security. We're aware of the elevator malfunction on floors 42 through 43. Emergency services are en route, but the storm is complicating response times." Miguel leaned toward the speaker. "This is Miguel Santos. I have a 62-year-old male experiencing what appears to be a cardiac event. He's conscious and responsive, but I need immediate access to the cardiac unit or emergency services. Miguel, this is Dr. Patricia Chen, in emergency. What's the patient's current status?" Richard listened in amazement as Miguel provided a detailed, professional assessment of his condition. Using medical terminology that Richard barely understood, but that clearly impressed Dr. Chen on the other end of the communication. "Miguel?" Dr. Chen's voice carried surprise and recognition. "Where did you learn to assess cardiac symptoms like that?" "Long story, doctor. Right now, I need guidance on stabilizing him until we can get this elevator moving." "Copy that. You're doing everything right. Keep monitoring his vitals and let me know if his condition changes." The communication ended, leaving Richard and Miguel alone again in the swaying elevator. The storm continued to rage outside, but something had changed in the small space between them. Richard was seeing Miguel clearly for the first time, and what he saw made him ashamed of the past 3 years of deliberate blindness. "How long?" Richard asked. "How long? What? How long have you been trying to get your medical license recognized?" Miguel's hands stilled for a moment. 3 years. The same 3 years I've been cleaning your office. What's the obstacle?" Miguel looked at him carefully, as if trying to determine whether the question was genuine. "Money, mostly. The exams cost thousands of dollars. The certification process requires documentation from Argentina that costs more thousands. And, while I'm studying and testing, I still need to work full-time to support Sophia." Richard's business mind was already calculating costs and solutions, but before he could speak, Miguel continued. "But it's not just the money. It's the time, the uncertainty. What if I spend everything I have and still fail? What if I can't pass the exams in English? What if I leave my job to study and then can't support my daughter?" His voice grew quiet. "It's easier to stay invisible. Safer." "Safer for who?" Richard asked. The question seemed to surprise Miguel. "For Sophia. For me. If you don't try, you can't fail." Richard studied Miguel's face, seeing the fear beneath the resignation. Here was a man with the skills to save lives, relegated to cleaning floors because the system was too complex and expensive to navigate, and because he was too afraid of failure to risk what little stability he had built. "That's a hell of a waste," Richard said finally. Miguel's expression hardened slightly. "Easy to say, when you've never had to choose between following your dreams and feeding your child." The words hit Richard like a physical blow, not because they were cruel, but because they were true. Richard had never had to make that choice. He had been born with advantages that let him take risks, fail spectacularly, and still land on his feet. He had built his empire on calculated risks that were only possible because he had safety nets Miguel had never possessed. The elevator shuddered again, and Richard felt another wave of chest pain. Miguel was immediately focused on him again, checking his pulse, monitoring his breathing, providing the kind of calm, competent care that Richard had only experienced in the most expensive private medical facilities. "Miguel," Richard said when the pain subsided, "when this is over, when I'm stable, I want to help you get your license." Miguel's hands stilled. "Mr. Blackwood, you don't owe me anything for doing what any decent person would do." "This isn't about owing," Richard said. "This is about waste. You're wasting your talents mopping floors when you could be saving lives. And I've been wasting 3 years walking past someone who could have been an asset. A colleague, maybe even a friend." The word friend hung in the air between them, strange and unfamiliar. Richard Blackwood didn't have friends. He had business associates, employees, people who wanted something from him. But this man, who was keeping him alive with skills he had spent years hiding, who had never asked for anything, who had accepted invisibility as the price of stability, this man felt like something different. "Why?" Miguel asked simply. Richard thought about the question, feeling the weight of it. "Because," he said finally, "I think I've been half dead for years, and I didn't even realize it until tonight." The elevator's lights flickered again, and in the brief darkness, Richard felt something shift in his chest that had nothing to do with his heart condition. It was the feeling of seeing clearly for the first time in years, of recognizing that the life he had built, successful, wealthy, powerful, had also been profoundly empty. "Miguel," Richard said quietly, "if we get out of this, if my heart holds up, I want to make you an offer." "What kind of offer?" Richard met his eyes directly. "I'll pay for everything. Every exam, every certification, every piece of documentation you need. In exchange, I want you to consider coming to work for me not as a janitor, but as what you really are. A doctor." Miguel stared at him for a long moment. "Mr. Blackwood, you're in medical distress. You shouldn't be making major decisions right now." Richard almost smiled. "Miguel, I've made bigger decisions than this on less sleep and more stress. But you're right to be skeptical. I've given you no reason to trust that I mean what I say." "It's not about trust," Miguel said carefully. "It's about reality. Men like you don't really see men like me. When this crisis passes, when you're back in your corner office, I'll be invisible again. That's just how the world works." The words stung because Richard knew they contained more truth than he wanted to admit. How many times had he made promises or commitments in moments of crisis, only to let them fade when the immediate danger passed? "What if I gave you something more than promises?" Richard asked. "Like what?" Richard thought for a moment, his business mind working even through the cardiac stress. "My company has a foundation. We could create a scholarship program for immigrant medical professionals seeking certification. Start with you, but expand it to help others in similar situations. Make it official, with oversight, with commitments that would be legally binding even if I changed my mind." Miguel looked at him with something that might have been hope, tempered by years of disappointment. "You would do that?" "I would do that," Richard said firmly. "But more than that, Miguel, I'm 62 years old. I've spent 40 years building a company that's worth billions, and I have no one to leave it to. No children, no real relationships, no legacy beyond buildings with my name on them." He paused, feeling the weight of that confession. "Maybe it's time I started thinking about what I actually want to leave behind." The elevator suddenly lurched, and both men felt it begin to move slowly downward. The building's backup power systems had apparently kicked in, and they were descending toward the emergency medical team that was waiting. "We're moving," Miguel said, his voice carrying relief. "Yeah," Richard said, but his eyes were fixed on Miguel's face. "Miguel, I need to ask you something, and I need you to answer honestly. Okay, if I offered you everything, I just described the money, the position, the foundation. Would you take it? Or would you be too proud to accept help from someone who spent 3 years treating you like you didn't exist? Miguel was quiet for a long moment, listening to the mechanical sounds of the elevator's descent. When he spoke, his voice was thoughtful and measured. Mr. Blackwood, pride is a luxury I gave up when I decided my daughter's welfare was more important than my ego. If you're serious about this offer, if it's real, and not just something you're saying because you're scared right now, then yes, I would take it. Not for me, but for Sophia, and for all the other people I could help if I were practicing medicine again. The elevator came to a stop, and they could hear voices in the hallway outside. Emergency medical personnel, building security, Dr. Chen's voice coordinating the response. In moments, the doors would open, and this strange, intimate bubble they had shared would be broken by the rush of professional medical care. Miguel, Richard said urgently, before they open those doors, I want you to know something. What happened here tonight, this isn't just about me having a cardiac episode. This is about me finally seeing someone I should have seen years ago. This is about recognizing that I've been building my empire on the backs of invisible people without ever acknowledging their humanity. The elevator doors began to open, revealing a team of paramedics with a gurney, Dr. Chen with her medical bag, and the bright lights of the hospital corridor beyond. This is about, Richard continued, his voice growing stronger even as the medical team rushed toward him, me finally understanding that real wealth isn't about what you own. It's about who you lift up. Dr. Chen was immediately at Richard's side, taking over his care with professional efficiency. Miguel stepped back, returning to his role as the invisible janitor. But Richard reached out and grabbed his wrist. Don't disappear on me, Miguel, Richard said as the paramedics began to transfer him to the gurney. We have work to do. Miguel nodded, his eyes bright with something that looked like hope tempered by years of hard-earned caution. I'll be here, Mr. Blackwood. I work the night shift. As they wheeled Richard toward the cardiac unit, he kept his eyes on Miguel until the hallway curved and broke their line of sight. For the first time in decades, Richard Blackwood had found something more valuable than money or power. He had found purpose. And in a few hours, when the doctors had stabilized his condition and confirmed that he would live to see another day, he was going to make good on every promise he had made in that elevator. Not because he owed Miguel Santos anything, but because he finally understood that his real wealth lay not in what he could accumulate, but in what he could give away. The storm outside was beginning to calm, but inside Manhattan Presbyterian Hospital, a different kind of storm was just beginning, one that would transform not just 2 lives, but everyone they touched. Because sometimes the most important conversations happen in the spaces between floors, in the moments when all pretense is stripped away, and we finally see each other as we really are. The cardiac monitoring unit at Manhattan Presbyterian hummed with quiet efficiency at 3 in the morning. Richard Blackwood lay in the adjustable hospital bed, connected to machines that tracked every beat of his damaged heart, every breath, every fluctuation in blood pressure. The storm had passed, leaving the city washed clean and gleaming under the first hints of dawn. But inside room 4247, a different kind of reckoning was just beginning. Dr. Patricia Chen sat beside his bed, her laptop open, reviewing the results of his emergency cardiac catheterization. Her expression was grave as she looked up at Richard, who was finally stable enough for a serious conversation about his condition. Mr. Blackwood, she began, her voice carrying the weight of difficult news. We need to talk about what we found. Richard had built his empire by facing bad news head-on, but something about the careful way Dr. Chen chose her words made his chest tighten with more than cardiac pain. How bad is it? Your left anterior descending artery is 92% blocked. We call it the widowmaker. For a reason. When it goes completely, most people don't survive. You're going to need immediate surgery to place a stent, possibly bypass surgery depending on what we find when we get in there. Richard absorbed this information with the same analytical calm he brought to hostile takeovers and billion-dollar negotiations. Timeline: we're scheduling you for first thing this morning. Dr. Martinez is our best cardiac surgeon. He'll be performing the procedure. Richard nodded, then asked the question that had been nagging at him since the elevator. Dr. Chen, the man who helped me last night? Miguel Santos. Where did he learn to recognize cardiac symptoms like that? Dr. Chen's expression shifted, becoming thoughtful and slightly troubled. That's actually something I've been wondering about myself. His assessment was textbook perfect, better than some residents I work with. I pulled his employment file, and there's nothing in there about medical training. There wouldn't be, Richard said quietly. He told me he went to medical school in Argentina, Universidad de Buenos Aires. He was in residency when he came to the United States. Dr. Chen's eyebrows rose. That explains a lot. Buenos Aires has an excellent medical program. If he was in residency there, he would have had extensive cardiac training. She paused, her expression growing more troubled. Mr. Blackwood, do you know why he's working as a janitor instead of practicing medicine? Licensing issues. Financial barriers. He has a 7-year-old daughter to support. Richard met Dr. Chen's eyes. He saved my life last night, with skills he's been hiding for 3 years, because our system couldn't figure out how to value what he actually knows. Dr. Chen was quiet for a moment, processing this information. Mr. Blackwood, I need to tell you something. After Miguel's assessment last night, I looked up the statistics on misdiagnosed cardiac events in emergency situations. If he hadn't been in that elevator with you, if you had just waited for the paramedics to arrive, there's a significant chance you wouldn't have made it. The words settled into Richard's chest like stones. Miguel Santos, the man he had walked past for 3 years without acknowledgement, had quite literally saved his life. I want to see him, Richard said. Mr. Blackwood, you need to rest before surgery. Dr. Chen, I'm about to undergo a procedure that could kill me. Before that happens, I need to see Miguel Santos. I need to thank him properly. And I need to make sure he understands that the offer I made in the elevator wasn't just fear talking. Dr. Chen studied his face, seeing the determination there. He's finishing his shift now. I could ask him to stop by before he leaves. Please. 20 minutes later, there was a soft knock on Richard's door. Miguel entered quietly, still wearing his janitor's uniform, a small duffel bag over his shoulder that probably contained his street clothes. He looked tired, the bone-deep exhaustion of someone who had worked a full night shift and then dealt with a medical emergency. Mr. Blackwood, Miguel said formally. Dr. Chen said you wanted to see me. How are you feeling? Like, I'm about to have my chest cracked open, Richard said honestly. But alive. Thanks to you. Please, sit down. Miguel hesitated, glancing at the visitor's chair beside the bed. Even now, even after everything that had happened, his body language spoke of someone who wasn't sure he belonged in a patient's private room. Miguel, please, sit. Miguel finally took the chair, setting his bag down carefully. Up close, in the hospital's fluorescent lighting, Richard could see details he had missed in the elevator. Miguel's hands were indeed calloused from years of manual labor, but they were also precise and careful surgeon's hands. His eyes held intelligence and compassion in equal measure, and there were lines around them that spoke of someone who worried constantly about things beyond his control. Dr. Chen told me more about my condition, Richard said. She also told me that if you hadn't been there last night, I probably wouldn't have survived until the paramedics arrived. Miguel shifted uncomfortably. Anyone with basic medical training would have done the same thing. But not anyone was there. You were, and you didn't have to help me. 3 years, Miguel. 3 years I've treated you like furniture, and when I was dying, you saved my life anyway. Miguel met his eyes for the first time since entering the room. Mr. Blackwood, what you said in the elevator last night about helping me get my medical license, about creating a foundation, were you serious? The directness of the question caught Richard off guard, but he appreciated it. Yes, completely serious. Why? Why? It was the same question Miguel had asked in the elevator, but now Richard had had time to think about his answer. Because last night, when I thought I might die, I realized that I've spent 40 years accumulating wealth and power, but I've never used any of it to actually help anyone. I've never built anything that made the world better. Richard paused, choosing his words carefully. Miguel, I looked up your medical school this morning on my phone. Universidad de Buenos Aires ranks in the top 50 medical programs in the world. You were training to be a cardiologist, weren't you? Miguel nodded slowly. Cardiovascular surgery was my specialty track. And now, you're mopping floors because our immigration and licensing system is too bureaucratic and expensive for you to practice the profession you trained. For, it's not that simple, Miguel said quietly. Yes, the system is difficult, but I also made choices. I chose security over risk. I chose to take a job that paid immediately, rather than gambling everything on a licensing process that might fail. Tell me about those choices, Richard said. Help me understand. Miguel looked out the window at the city awakening below. When he spoke, his voice carried the weight of years of careful calculation and sacrifice. When I arrived in New York 5 years ago, Sophia was 2 years old. Her mother had left us 6 months earlier. She couldn't handle the uncertainty of immigration, the financial stress, the isolation. I had $800 in my pocket, a medical degree that wasn't recognized here, and a toddler who needed food and shelter. Miguel's hands tightened around the strap of his duffel bag. I could have spent that $800 on documentation and exam fees. I could have borrowed money to study while looking for medical work. But what if I failed? What if I couldn't pass the English language medical exams? What if I ran out of money before I found work? Sophia would have paid the price for my gamble. Richard listened, beginning to understand the impossible mathematics of poverty, how every choice became a life-or-death calculation when you had no safety net. So you took the janitor job, Richard said. So I took the first job I could find that offered immediate income and health insurance for Sophia. The night shift paid slightly more, and it meant I could be home during the day when she wasn't in school. Miguel's voice grew softer. I told myself it was temporary, that I would save money and eventually pursue my licensing. But medical exams cost thousands of dollars. Documentation from Argentina costs thousands more. And while I'm studying and testing, I still need to work full-time. How much? Richard asked. Total cost for everything you need to get licensed here. Miguel looked surprised by the directness of the question. I've researched it extensively. Exam fees, documentation, transcript verification, residency applications, probably somewhere between $40,000 and $60,000, depending on how many attempts it takes to pass everything. Richard did quick mental math. $60,000. That was what he spent on wine in a good year. It was less than he paid for the art in his office reception area. It was a rounding error in his annual budget. And how long would the process take? 2 years minimum? Probably 3. That's assuming I pass everything on the first try and get matched to a residency program immediately. 3 years. Richard repeated. 3 years of reduced income while supporting a daughter and paying for exams and documentation. You see the problem. Richard did see the problem, but he also saw something else. Miguel, what you're describing, the responsibility you felt for Sophia, the sacrifice you were willing to make, the way you calculated risk versus security, that's not a character flaw. That's the exact kind of careful, thoughtful decision-making I'd want in a doctor. Miguel looked at him sharply. Mr. Blackwood, Richard, please. After last night, I think we can use first names. Miguel seemed to consider this, then nodded. Richard, I appreciate what you're saying, but I need you to understand something. I'm not looking for charity. I've survived 5 years by being self-reliant. I don't want to become dependent on someone else's generosity, especially someone who might change their mind when the crisis passes. The honesty was like a cold splash of water, but Richard respected it. Miguel had every reason to be skeptical of promises made by wealthy men in moments of vulnerability. What if it wasn't charity? Richard asked. What if it was an investment? What do you mean? Richard shifted in his hospital bed, his business mind fully engaged now. Miguel, I own Blackwood Enterprises. We have real estate holdings across the Northeast, including several medical facilities and 3 hospitals. We also have a foundation that's currently focused on urban development, but could easily expand into healthcare and education. He paused, making sure Miguel was following. What if we created a program not just for you, but for immigrant medical professionals who are underemployed because of licensing barriers? We provide financial support for the certification process, and in return, participants commit to working in underserved communities for a specified period after they get licensed. Miguel's expression grew thoughtful. A service commitment program. Exactly. Like the military does with medical school, but for immigrant doctors. We invest in your education and certification, and you invest your skills where they're needed most. And you think there would be others in my situation? Richard pulled out his phone and showed Miguel a web page he'd been reading while waiting for him to arrive. There are over 10,000 foreign-trained doctors driving cabs, working in restaurants, or doing manual labor in New York City alone. 10,000 medical professionals whose skills are being wasted because the licensing process is too expensive and complicated to navigate alone. Miguel stared at the statistics, his expression shifting from skepticism toward something that looked like hope. But more than that, Richard continued, I need this for myself. I need a purpose that goes beyond accumulating more money. Last night, when I thought I might die, I realized that all the wealth I've built means nothing if I don't use it to actually help people. And you think helping me would help you? I think helping people like you would give my life meaning it's never had before. Miguel was quiet for a long moment, processing everything Richard had said. Outside the window, the sun was fully up now, painting the city in warm gold light. Richard, Miguel said finally, if you're serious about this, and I mean really serious, not just grateful because I saved your life serious, then I need to know something about you. Ask me anything. Why don't you have family, children, someone to build a legacy for besides buildings and bank accounts? The question hit deeper than Richard had expected. He found himself thinking about choices he had made, opportunities he had missed, relationships he had sacrificed for the sake of business success. Because I've spent 40 years believing that success meant winning, and winning meant never showing vulnerability or need or dependence on anyone else. Richard's voice grew quiet. I've been married twice. Both marriages ended because I couldn't let my guard down enough to actually connect with another human being. He looked directly at Miguel. Last night, in that elevator, was the first honest conversation I've had with another person in years. Maybe decades. And it took a cardiac episode and being trapped in a small space to make it happen. Miguel nodded slowly, as if this explanation made sense to him. Miguel, can I ask you something now? Of course. Your daughter, Sophia. What does she think about your work? About the fact that you're not practicing medicine? Miguel's entire demeanor changed at the mention of his daughter. His face softened, and something bright entered his eyes. She's proud of me for working hard to take care of her. But, he paused, seeming to weigh his words. Last month, her teacher asked the class to write about what their parents do for work. Sophia wrote that her daddy is a doctor who cleans the hospital to keep people safe. Richard felt something tighten in his throat that had nothing to do with his cardiac condition. She sees me as a doctor, even though I've been hiding from that identity for 5 years. She doesn't understand why I don't help sick people anymore. What did you tell her? I told her that sometimes grown-ups have to do different jobs than the ones they trained for, but that doesn't mean they stop being who they really are inside. The words hung in the air between them, carrying weight that went far beyond the immediate conversation. Miguel, Richard said quietly, what if we could change that? What if Sophia could see her father practicing medicine again? Miguel's voice was barely above a whisper. Richard, you don't understand what that would mean to me. To her. Then help me understand. Tell me about Sophia. If you're hooked on this story, make sure to subscribe and turn on notifications so you never miss an upload. Your support means everything and helps me bring you more emotional stories like this one. Miguel reached into his duffel bag and pulled out his phone, scrolling to his photos. He handed it to Richard, who saw a little girl with dark eyes that sparkled with intelligence and mischief. She was missing her 2 front teeth, and her smile was absolutely radiant. She's beautiful, Richard said, meaning it. She's why I get up every morning, why I work nights, why I've spent 5 years being invisible. Everything I do is for her. Richard scrolled through more photos. Sophia at a science fair, holding a poster about the human heart. Sophia in a white coat that was far too big for her, playing doctor with a teddy bear. Sophia asleep at their small kitchen table, surrounded by homework and crayons. She wants to be a doctor, Richard observed. She wants to help people the way she thinks her daddy helps people. She doesn't understand that mopping floors isn't the same as saving lives. Richard handed the phone back, but kept looking at Miguel's face. What if it could be the same? What if you could show her that her father is exactly the kind of doctor she wants to become? Richard, you're talking about changing everything. My life, her life, our entire future. That's terrifying. Why? Because what if I fail? What if I can't pass the exams after 5 years away from medicine? What if I get my license back and discover I'm not as good as I used to be? What if I disappoint everyone who believed in me? Richard recognized the fear in Miguel's voice because he had felt it himself. The terror of risking everything you had built for the chance of something better. Miguel, can I tell you what I've learned in 40 years of business? Tell me. The biggest risk is not taking any risk at all. Every major success I've had came from betting on myself when I wasn't sure I could win. And every major regret I have came from playing it safe when I should have taken the chance. Richard shifted in his hospital bed, leaning forward slightly. Right now, you're teaching Sophia that dreams are luxuries poor people can't afford. But what if instead, you showed her that dreams are worth fighting for, even when the odds are against you? Miguel was quiet for a long moment, staring at his hands. There's something else, Richard said gently. Something I haven't told you yet. Miguel looked up. My surgery this morning, it's complicated. There's a chance I might not make it through. Miguel's expression immediately shifted into medical mode. What did Dr. Chen tell you about the risks? 95% success rate for the procedure, but my overall cardiac health is poor. Age, stress, years of ignoring symptoms. Richard met Miguel's eyes. If something goes wrong, if I don't survive this, I want to know that the promises I made to you last night will be kept. Richard, you're going to be fine. Doctor, Martinez is excellent, and your condition, while serious, is very treatable. Maybe, but I've spent too many years assuming I'd have time to do the right thing later. I don't want to make that mistake again. Richard reached for the bedside table and pulled out a business card. He wrote something on the back and handed it to Miguel. That's my lawyer's direct number. I called him this morning and had him draw up paperwork establishing the foundation we discussed. Win or lose, that money is set aside specifically to help immigrant medical professionals get licensed in the United States. You'll be the first beneficiary, but not the last. Miguel stared at the card, then at Richard. You did this in the 6 hours since we were in the elevator together? I did this because 6 hours ago, I finally understood what I wanted my legacy to be. Miguel's voice was thick with emotion. Richard, I don't know what to say. Say you'll take the chance. Say you'll let me help you become the doctor your daughter already believes you are. Miguel looked out the window again. At the city where he had spent 5 years being invisible, where his medical skills had been hidden behind a mop and bucket. When he looked back at Richard, his eyes held determination mixed with fear. If I do this, if I take your help and go through the licensing process, I want to make you a promise in return. What promise? I want to specialize in cardiac surgery again. And I want my first case, when I'm fully licensed and working as a doctor again, to be following up on your care. I want to be the one who makes sure that what happened to you last night never happens to you again. Richard felt tears gathering in his eyes, surprising him with their intensity. Miguel, that would be an honor? They sat in comfortable silence for a moment, both men understanding that something fundamental had shifted between them. They were no longer strangers separated by class and circumstance. They were partners in something larger than either of them could accomplish alone. There's one more thing, Richard said. I want to meet Sophia. After my surgery, when I'm recovered, I want you to bring her to see me. I want to meet the little girl who's been the driving force behind her father's sacrifices. Miguel smiled, the first genuinely relaxed smile Richard had seen from him. She would love that. She's never met a real billionaire before. Richard laughed, surprising himself. And I've never met a future doctor who's 7 years old. I have a feeling she and I are going to get along very well. A knock on the door interrupted them. Dr. Chen entered, accompanied by a surgical nurse. Mr. Blackwood, we're ready to prep you for surgery. Dr. Martinez is scrubbing in now. Richard looked at Miguel. Will you be here when I wake up? I'll be here, Miguel promised. And Richard? Thank you for seeing me, for believing in me, for giving me back hope. Thank you for saving my life. And Miguel? Yes? When I wake up, I want to hear you called Dr. Santos. We're going to make that happen. Miguel stood, shouldering his duffel bag. Dr. Santos, he repeated, as if trying the words on for size. I like the sound of that. As the medical team began preparing Richard for surgery, Miguel paused at the door. Richard? Yeah? Fix my heart valve, and I'll believe you were serious about all of this, Miguel said with a slight smile. Richard grinned, even as the pre-surgical medication began to make him drowsy. Scalpel, he replied. Miguel laughed a sound of pure joy that filled the hospital room with warmth. As he left, Richard closed his eyes, feeling more at peace than he had in years. He was about to undergo major cardiac surgery, but his heart, the part that mattered most, already felt whole again. The cardiac surgery unit at Manhattan Presbyterian fell into the kind of hushed tension that always preceded complex procedures. Elena Martinez scrubbed her hands with methodical precision, reviewing Richard Blackwood's case file one final time. The 92% blockage in his left anterior descending artery was severe, but she had successfully treated worse cases. What concerned her was not the technical challenge, but the patient's overall cardiac health. Years of stress, poor diet, and ignored symptoms had taken their toll. In the waiting area outside the surgical unit, Miguel Santos sat in an uncomfortable plastic chair, still wearing his janitor's uniform. He had called in sick for his day job at a construction site, the first time he had missed work in 3 years, because he had promised Richard he would be there when the surgery was over. Sophia was at school, unaware that her father's entire future hung in the balance of a procedure being performed on a man she had never met. Miguel checked his phone for the dozenth time in an hour. The surgery had been underway for 3 hours and 47 minutes. Dr. Martinez had estimated 4 hours for the procedure. But Miguel knew from his medical training that cardiac surgeries often ran longer than expected, especially when complications arose. At 4 hours and 15 minutes, Dr. Chen emerged from the surgical unit. Her scrubs were wrinkled, and there was a tightness around her eyes that made Miguel's stomach clench with worry. "Miguel," she said, sitting down beside him, "Richard asked me specifically to update you on his condition." "How is he?" Miguel's voice was steadier than he felt. "The surgery was successful. Dr. Martinez was able to place 2 stents and restore blood flow to his heart, but there were complications." Miguel's medical training kicked in, and he began asking the right questions. What kind of complications? Arrhythmia? Bleeding? His heart stopped twice during the procedure. "We had to use the defibrillator to get him back, and his recovery is going to be more complicated than we initially hoped." "Doctor," Chen paused, choosing her words carefully. "Miguel, Richard's condition was worse than any of us realized. The blockage we treated was just the most immediate threat. He has significant coronary artery disease throughout his cardiac system. He's going to need major lifestyle changes, ongoing medical management, and possibly additional procedures down the line." Miguel absorbed this information with the analytical part of his mind, but the emotional impact hit harder than he expected. In the space of 24 hours, Richard Blackwood had gone from being a stranger who ignored him to someone whose survival mattered deeply, to Miguel's future and his daughter's dreams. "Can I see him?" "He's in recovery now. Still sedated. He should wake up within the next hour or 2. Dr. Chen studied Miguel's face. "Number 2, Miguel, can I ask you something?" "Of course." "Richard told me about the foundation he's establishing, about his plans to help you get your medical license. Is that real? Or is it something he said under stress?" Miguel pulled out the business card Richard had given him with his lawyer's phone number written on the back. "I called the number this morning while Richard was in surgery. The foundation is real. The paperwork has been filed. The money has been transferred." Dr. Chen's eyebrows rose. "He actually did it." "Apparently, Richard Blackwood is a man who keeps his promises." "Miguel, if you don't mind me asking, what are you going to do? Are you going to take his help and pursue your medical license?" Miguel had been asking himself the same question for hours. The smart, safe answer was to be grateful for Richard's generosity, but to continue with his current life. Taking Richard's offer meant risking everything he had built for Sophia: their small but stable apartment, his steady income, the predictability that had kept them afloat for 5 years. But it also meant the possibility of becoming the man his daughter already believed he was. "Sure. If you had a choice between a job that kept you safe but unfulfilled, and the chance to do the work you were meant to do, but with no guarantee of success, which would you choose? Dr. Chen considered the question carefully. 5 years ago, I would have said safety every time. But now, after watching what Richard went through last night, after seeing how close he came to dying because he ignored his health for the sake of business success, I think safety is an illusion. The only real security comes from knowing you're living the life you were meant to live. Miguel nodded slowly. That's what I keep coming back to. I've spent 5 years trying to keep Sophia safe by being invisible. But maybe I've been teaching her the wrong lesson. Maybe I've been teaching her to be afraid of her own potential. 2 hours later, Miguel sat beside Richard's bed in the cardiac intensive care unit. Richard was awake but groggy, connected to monitors and IV lines that tracked his slow but steady recovery. His face was pale, but his eyes were alert and focused when he saw Miguel. "You came," Richard said, his voice hoarse from the breathing tube. "I promised I would be here. How did the surgery go?" "Doctor?" Chen was diplomatic, but I could tell there were complications. Miguel gave Richard the medical facts straightforwardly. The successful stent placement, the cardiac arrests during surgery, the more extensive coronary disease that had been discovered. "So, I'm not out of the woods yet," Richard said. "No, but you're alive. And with proper care and lifestyle changes, you can live a long, healthy life." Miguel paused. "As a end quote. Richard, I need to tell you something." "What's that?" "While you were in surgery, I called your lawyer. The foundation is real. You actually did everything you said you would do." Richard managed a weak smile. "Did you think I was lying? I thought you were a wealthy man who made promises in a moment of crisis that you might regret when the crisis passed." "And now?" Miguel looked directly at Richard, his voice carrying new conviction. "Now I think you're a man who understands that some promises are too important to break. So you'll take the help? You'll pursue your medical license?" Miguel had been rehearsing this conversation in his head for hours. But now that the moment was here, he felt nervous about voicing the decision that would change everything. "Richard, I've spent 5 years being afraid of failing, afraid of disappointing Sophia, afraid of losing what little security we had. But last night, watching you in that elevator, I remembered something I had forgotten." "What's that?" "I remembered why I became a doctor in the first place. It wasn't for money or prestige or security. It was because I couldn't stand to watch people suffer when I had the skills to help them." Miguel's voice grew stronger. "For 5 years, I've been watching people suffer, including myself, because I was too afraid to risk what I had for the chance of becoming who I was meant to be. And now I'm ready to take the risk. I'm going to accept your help, and I'm going to get my medical license back. Not just for me, but for Sophia. I want her to see that dreams are worth fighting for, even when you're scared." Richard's eyes filled with tears. "Miguel, that's the best news I've heard all day." "There's more," Miguel said, pulling out his phone. "I want to show you something." He scrolled to a photo that had been taken that morning at Sophia's school. It showed Sophia at the front of her classroom, presenting a project to her classmates. She was holding a poster board covered with pictures of hearts and medical equipment, and her teacher had written a note on the back. Richard read the note aloud. "Sophia presented her project on my hero, my dad. Today, she told the class that her father is a doctor who saves people's lives, and that someday she wants to be just like him." She spoke with such pride and conviction that there wasn't a dry eye in the classroom. Miguel's voice was thick with emotion. "She did that project yesterday, while I was at work. She's been telling everyone that her father is a doctor, even though she's never seen me practice medicine. She believes in me more than I've believed in myself. She sees who you really are," Richard said quietly. "And now, I need to become worthy of what she sees." Richard struggled to sit up slightly in his hospital bed. "Miguel, I want to make you another promise. When you get your medical license back, when you're practicing medicine again, I want you to consider joining my medical foundation not just as a beneficiary, but as a partner." "What do you have? Mean?" I mean, I want you to help me identify other immigrant medical professionals who are in the same situation you were in. I want you to help design the program that will bring their skills back into the healthcare system where they belong." Miguel stared at Richard, processing the magnitude of what was being offered. "You're talking about changing hundreds of lives. I'm talking about changing the system that wastes human potential because it's too bureaucratic and expensive to recognize the value of what people already know." Before Miguel could respond, there was a soft knock on the door. Dr. Chen entered, followed by a small figure that made both men's faces light up with surprise. Sofia Santos stood in the doorway, wearing her school uniform and clutching a handmade get-well card. Her dark eyes were wide as she took in the medical equipment. But she showed no fear, only curiosity and concern. "Papa?" she said, in her clear, sweet voice. "The nurse said I could visit for a few minutes." Miguel stood immediately. "Sofia, what are you doing here? You should be at aftercare. Mrs. Rodriguez brought me. She said you called the school and said it was important for me to meet someone." Miguel looked confused, then turned to Dr. Chen, who was smiling. "I hope you don't mind," Dr. Chen said. "Richard asked me to arrange for Sofia to come by. He said there was someone he wanted to meet." Richard had managed to sit up more in his bed, and he was looking at Sofia with gentle interest. "You must be Sofia. I'm Richard. Your father told me all about you." Sofia approached the bed with the careful politeness of a well-raised child. "Are you the man my papa helped when you were sick?" "Yes, I am. Your papa saved my life." Sofia's face broke into a radiant smile. "That's because my papa is the best doctor in the world, even when he's not being a doctor right now." The simple faith in her voice made both men emotional. Richard cleared his throat. "Sofia, your papa is going to start being a doctor again very soon. Would you like that?" Sofia's eyes went wide. "Really, Papa? Is that true?" Miguel knelt down to his daughter's eye level. "Yes, Mija. Mister, Richard is going to help Papa go back to school and take tests so I can be a doctor again." Sofia threw her arms around Miguel's neck. "I knew it. I told everyone at school that my papa was the best doctor, and now everyone will see." Richard watched this exchange with a feeling he had never experienced before, the deep satisfaction that came from using his wealth and influence to create genuine joy, rather than just accumulate more for himself. "Sofia," Richard said, "can you do me a favor?" She turned to look at him, her small hand still holding her father's. "What kind of favor? Can you help me get better? The doctors say I need to change how I live, and I think I could use a consultant who knows about taking care of people." Sofia considered this request with the seriousness of a child who had been asked to take on an important responsibility. "What do you need to do to get better?" "I need to eat healthier food, exercise more, and remember to take my medicine every day." Sofia nodded thoughtfully. "Papa makes me eat vegetables even when I don't want to, and he always remembers my vitamins. Maybe he could teach you." Richard looked at Miguel with raised eyebrows. "Would you be willing to take on an additional patient? Pro bono work? While you're studying for your medical boards?" Miguel smiled the genuine, relaxed smile of a man who had finally stopped fighting against his own destiny. "I think I could manage that." Over the following weeks, as Richard recovered from his surgery and Miguel began the process of studying for his medical licensing exams, An unlikely friendship developed. Richard discovered that having people to care about made his own recovery easier and more meaningful. Miguel discovered that having someone believe in his potential gave him the courage to push through the difficult moments of doubt that came with returning to medical study after 5 years away. Sophia became a regular visitor to Richard's penthouse apartment during his recovery period, arriving with her father for what they called health checkups, but which were really excuses for an old man to experience the joy of family connection for the first time in his life. 3 months after the elevator incident, Miguel passed his first medical licensing exam. 6 months later, he passed his second. The process was exactly as difficult and expensive as he had feared. But with Richard's financial support and emotional encouragement, the obstacles that had seemed impossible to overcome became merely challenging. Richard's recovery was equally transformative. With Miguel's medical guidance and Sophia's enthusiastic enforcement of healthy habits, he lost 40 pounds, began exercising regularly, and discovered that vegetables could actually taste good when prepared properly. More importantly, he discovered that using his wealth to help others gave him a sense of purpose that accumulating more wealth had never provided. 18 months after that night in the elevator, Dr. Miguel Santos walked across the stage at New York University's Medical Center to receive his certification as a licensed physician in the United States. In the audience, Richard Blackwood sat beside Sophia Santos, both of them applauding wildly as Miguel shook hands with the dean and accepted the diploma that represented not just his personal achievement, but the first success of the Blackwood Foundation's Immigrant Medical Professional Program. As Miguel looked out at the audience, his eyes found the two people who had believed in him when he had stopped believing in himself. Richard, whose cardiac health had improved dramatically over the past year and a half, looked 20 years younger and infinitely happier than the man who had collapsed in an elevator. Sophia, now 8 years old and missing different teeth, was holding a sign that read, "My Papa the Doctor," in careful block letters. After the ceremony, as the three of them walked together through Central Park, Sophia skipping ahead while Richard and Miguel talked, Miguel reflected on the journey that had brought them all to this moment. "Richard," Miguel said, "do you ever wonder what would have happened if that elevator hadn't broken down?" Richard considered the question seriously. "I think I would have died. Maybe not that night, but eventually. I was dying a little bit every day from the emptiness of the life I was living. And now?" Richard looked ahead at Sophia, who had stopped to examine an interesting rock and was calling them over to see her discovery. "Now I understand the difference between being alive and actually living." Miguel smiled. "So do I." 6 months later, Dr. Miguel Santos performed his first surgery as a fully licensed cardiac surgeon in the United States. The patient was a 73-year-old man who had been brought to the emergency room with symptoms of a massive heart attack. The surgery was complex, requiring Miguel to draw on every skill he had learned in Argentina and everything he had relearned during his certification process. When the surgery was complete and the patient was stable, Miguel walked to the waiting room to speak with the family. As he pushed through the doors in his surgical scrubs, he saw Richard Blackwood sitting in the corner, reading a magazine and waiting patiently. "What are you doing here?" Miguel asked. Richard looked up and smiled. "I wanted to be here for your first surgery." "How did it go?" "Successfully. The patient should make a full recovery." "I knew he would." He had the best cardiac surgeon in the city working on him. Miguel sat down beside Richard, suddenly exhausted in the way that came after intense concentration and high stakes. "Richard, I need to thank you again for everything you've done. The foundation, the financial support, believing in me when I couldn't believe in myself." Richard shook his head. "Miguel, you saved my life twice. Once in that elevator, and once by giving me a purpose that actually mattered. How many families have we helped now through the foundation. How many families have we helped now? 47 medical professionals from 23 different countries. Doctors, nurses, specialists, all practicing in underserved communities across the Northeast. And that's just the beginning. Miguel leaned back in his chair, thinking about the ripple effects of one night in a broken elevator. 47 medical professionals whose skills were now being used to save lives instead of being wasted in jobs that didn't match their training. Hundreds of patients who would receive better care because of those doctors and nurses. Children like Sophia, who would grow up seeing their parents fulfill their potential instead of settling for invisibility. "Miguel," Richard said, "there's something I want to tell you." "What's that?" "I've been talking to my lawyers about my will, about what happens to my money when I die." Miguel looked at him with concern. "Richard, you're healthy now. Your cardiac health is excellent. You don't need to be thinking about, 'I'm 74 years old, and I've had major cardiac surgery. I need to think about it.'" Richard's voice was calm and matter-of-fact. "I want to leave the majority of my estate to the foundation. I want the work we started to continue long after I'm gone." Miguel was quiet for a moment, overwhelmed by the magnitude of what Richard was proposing. "But more than that," Richard continued, "I want you to know that in the past 2 years, you and Sophia have become the family I never had. You've given my life meaning and purpose and joy that I never knew existed." Miguel felt tears gathering in his eyes. "Richard, you've given us the same thing. Sophia adores you. You're the grandfather she never had. And you're the son I never had." They sat in comfortable silence for a moment. Two men whose lives had intersected by chance in a broken elevator and who had discovered that the collision had saved them both. "Papa! Mr. Richard!" They turned to see Sophia running down the hospital hallway, her school backpack bouncing as she moved. She threw herself into Miguel's arms, then reached out to include Richard in the hug. "How was your first surgery, Papa? Did you save someone?" "Yes, Mija. I saved someone. I knew you would. You're the best doctor in the world." As Richard looked at Miguel and Sophia, father and daughter united in their mutual admiration and love, he realized that wealth could indeed buy happiness, not through accumulation, but through giving, not through taking, but through lifting others up. And in that moment, sitting in a hospital waiting room with the family he had found in the most unlikely circumstances, Richard Blackwood finally understood what true success looked like. It looked like a little girl who believed her father could do anything, and a father who had finally found the courage to prove her right. It looked like second chances and transformed lives, and the recognition that we are all more alike than different, regardless of the jobs we do, or the money we have, or the languages we speak at home. Most of all, it looked like love. The kind of love that sees potential, where others see only problems, that offers help without expecting anything in return, and that understands that the greatest wealth is measured not in dollars, but in the lives we touch and the hope we create. Thank you so much for watching until the end. If you loved this story, check out the other videos on your screen now. I think you'll really enjoy them. And don't forget to subscribe if you haven't already. See you in the next story.